"We called your parents 3 times," the nurse said softly as she adjusted the blanket over my legs. "But your grandfather was the only one who came." I stared at the pale hospital ceiling, still wearing part of my graduation gown beneath the thin white sheet. 1 hour earlier, I had been standing under bright stadium lights with hundreds of other seniors, smiling for photos while the marching band played and parents cheered from the bleachers. Now the fluorescent lights above me buzzed quietly, and the room smelled like antiseptic and cold coffee. My head throbbed every time I moved. A plastic hospital bracelet pressed against my wrist where my graduation bracelet had been only that morning. I turned my head slowly toward the empty chair beside the bed. Nobody sat there. Not my mother with her perfectly curled blonde hair and expensive perfume. Not my father checking emails between conversations. Nobody. The nurse gave me a sympathetic smile before stepping out into the hallway. I could hear phones ringing somewhere in the distance and the squeak of rubber soles against polished floors. Outside my room, someone laughed softly. Life kept moving while mine felt strangely still. I closed my eyes for a second and tried to remember exactly what had happened. One moment, I had been walking across the stage to receive my diploma from North Ridge University, hearing applause echo through the football stadium. The next, the world tilted sideways. My vision blurred. My knees gave out beneath me. Then darkness. I remembered waking briefly to voices around me. Someone saying my blood pressure was dangerously low. Someone else asking if I had eaten anything that day. I had lied and said yes. The truth was I hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. Tuition had gone up again this semester, and after paying rent and utilities, groceries had become optional some weeks. I kept telling myself things would get easier after graduation, that once I got my degree and found a stable job, maybe my parents would finally look at me with something other than disappointment. My mother cared about appearances more than people. She liked posting family photos online with captions about love and blessings, but she rarely asked how I was actually doing. My father treated emotions like inconveniences that interrupted his schedule. Growing up, I learned quickly that achievements got attention. Exhaustion didn't. Pain didn't. Loneliness definitely didn't. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Then I heard the familiar creak of old work boots against tile flooring. I looked toward the doorway just as my grandfather stepped carefully into the room, holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations wrapped in crinkled plastic. His gray flannel shirt smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil, and his weathered hands tightened around the flowers as if he worried they weren't good enough. "Hey there, sweetheart," Grandpa Walter said quietly. His voice carried the rough warmth of someone who had spent his whole life fixing things with his hands. "You scared me pretty good." Something inside my chest cracked then, not painfully, but softly, like ice melting after a long winter. He walked over slowly and set the flowers beside my bed before lowering himself into the chair with a tired sigh. I noticed grease stains near the cuff of his jeans. He must have come straight from his garage workshop without even changing clothes. "Did they call Mom and Dad?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Grandpa looked down at his hands for a moment before nodding once. "They said they were busy talking with some people after the ceremony," he answered carefully. "Your mama mentioned they'd come by later if things settled down." Later. The word sat heavily between us. Grandpa reached over and gently pulled the edge of my blanket higher over my shoulder the same way he used to when I fell asleep on his couch as a little girl. "I brought your favorite cherry candies too," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket with a faint smile. "Figured hospitals shouldn't get all the say around here." And sitting there in that quiet hospital room, staring at the old man everyone in my family overlooked, I realized he was the only person who had ever truly shown up when it mattered. Grandpa Walter stayed beside my hospital bed long after the sun disappeared behind the parking garage. Outside my window, the carnations he brought sat in a plastic cup near the sink, slightly crooked but somehow more beautiful than the expensive flower arrangements lining the nurse's station down the hall. Every once in a while, he would glance over at me from his chair just to make sure I was still awake, still breathing, still there. Around 8 that evening, my phone buzzed against the tray table beside me. I picked it up slowly, expecting maybe a message from my mother saying they were finally on their way. Instead, it was a social media notification. My mother had uploaded graduation pictures. In the first photo, she stood smiling beside my father underneath the stadium lights, both of them dressed perfectly, as if they had stepped out of a magazine advertisement. The caption read, "Proud day for our family. So grateful for this beautiful milestone. I stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly locking the phone again. Not one picture included me. Grandpa noticed the expression on my face, but did not ask questions right away. That was one thing I always loved about him. He never forced pain out of people before they were ready to speak about it. Instead, he reached into the paper bag sitting near his boots and pulled out a wrapped turkey sandwich from the little diner off Route 8. "You need real food," he said gently. "Hospital crackers do not count as dinner." I managed a weak smile as he handed it to me. The sandwich was still warm. My throat tightened unexpectedly because he must have stopped to buy it on the way here after leaving his workshop. Small things like that always undid me more than grand gestures ever could. I unwrapped the sandwich slowly while Grandpa leaned back in the chair, rubbing one hand over his tired eyes. His knuckles looked rough and cracked from decades of working on engines and repairing machinery. Even at 78, he still spent most mornings fixing old trucks in the garage behind his house because he hated sitting still. "Remember when you were 7 and tried making pancakes by yourself?" he asked suddenly with a faint smile. "Nearly burned down my whole kitchen." I laughed softly for the first time all day. "You still ate them anyway. That is because you looked so proud carrying that plate over." He chuckled quietly before his expression softened again. "You always worked too hard trying to earn love from people who should have given it freely." The room fell silent after that. I looked down at the sandwich in my hands because I did not know how to answer him. The truth was, he was right. My entire life had become one long attempt to deserve attention from my parents. Straight A's, scholarships, student leadership awards, part-time jobs, volunteer hours. Every achievement felt like another ticket I handed them, hoping eventually one of them would finally say they were proud of me without sounding distracted. But somehow it was never enough. There was always another comparison, another criticism hidden inside advice. Another reminder that somebody else's daughter had done better. My mother once spent an entire dinner talking about her friend's son getting accepted into medical school without asking how my own semester had gone. My father forgot my major twice during freshman year. Yet Grandpa remembered every little detail. Every exam date. Every apartment address. Every panic attack I tried hiding over the phone by pretending I had allergies. A nurse entered quietly to check my blood pressure before smiling at Grandpa. "You are still here," she said warmly. Grandpa shrugged like it was obvious. "Of course I am." The nurse adjusted my blanket and looked at him again. "Most people leave after visiting hours." Grandpa glanced toward me before answering in that calm, steady voice of his. "She should not wake up alone." Something inside my chest hurt then, but not in the same hollow way it used to around my parents. This ache felt different, softer somehow. Like finally realizing that love was never supposed to feel conditional in the first place. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds and thin golden lines across the floor. Grandpa Walter was asleep in the chair beside my bed, his arms folded tightly across his chest and his chin resting against the collar of his flannel shirt. At some point during the night, a nurse had draped a spare blanket over his shoulders. Even asleep, he looked tired in a way I had never fully noticed before. The deep lines around his eyes seemed heavier. His hands twitched occasionally like they still remembered decades of turning wrenches and lifting heavy engine parts. I watched him quietly for a long moment before reaching for my phone again. There were 12 notifications waiting. Messages from classmates. A few texts from professors checking on me. Social media tags from graduation photos I had never gotten to pose for. But only one message from my parents. My mother had texted at 11:43 the night before. "We heard you were feeling better. Call us when you are discharged so we can discuss what happened yesterday." People were very concerned. I read the message twice. Not once did she ask if I was okay. Not once did she say she loved me. Just concern about appearances. About what people might say. My father had not texted at all. I slowly locked the phone again and set it face down on the tray beside me. Outside the room, I could hear hospital carts rattling through the hallway and the faint hum of morning announcements overhead. Grandpa stirred awake a few seconds later and blinked toward me. "Morning, kiddo," he said softly, his voice rough from sleeping upright. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I lied automatically. He gave me a long look that told me he recognized the lie immediately, but chose not to challenge it. Instead, he stood carefully, stretching his stiff back with a quiet wince before walking over to the window. "Snow coming tonight," he murmured while looking out over the parking lot. "Sky has that look to it." I nodded faintly, even though I barely cared about the weather. My chest still felt heavy from my mother's message. Grandpa turned back toward me after a moment. You know, he said gently, your grandmother used to say some people only know how to love through performance. They put on smiles, throw parties, take photographs. But when life gets messy, they disappear because real love asks something from them. I swallowed hard at that because it described my parents too perfectly. Growing up in our house always felt like living inside a carefully staged commercial. Everything looked polished from the outside. Christmas cards with matching sweaters. Expensive birthday dinners at restaurants downtown. Vacation photos smiling beside beaches and ski resorts. But behind closed doors, silence filled most of the rooms. My mother spent more time correcting me than listening to me. My father was physically present, but emotionally somewhere else entirely. I remembered being 13 years old and winning first place at the regional science fair. Grandpa had driven 3 hours just to sit in a folding chair inside the school gymnasium and clap louder than anyone when my name was announced. My parents arrived 40 minutes late because my father had a networking dinner. On the drive home, my mother spent most of the ride complaining that the event had run too long and ruined her evening plans. At 16, I had my first panic attack before a debate competition. My hands shook so badly I could not hold my notes properly. Grandpa sat with me in the parking lot afterward while I cried from embarrassment. He bought me hot chocolate from a gas station vending machine and told me being overwhelmed did not make me weak. My parents never even knew it happened because they had not attended the competition. Looking back now, I realized something that hurt more than the collapse itself. My body had not suddenly failed me yesterday. It had been warning me for years. The exhaustion, the anxiety, the skipped meals, the constant pressure to earn affection that should have come freely. Yesterday was simply the first time my body finally refused to keep pretending everything was fine. The doctor discharged me later that afternoon with strict instructions to rest, eat properly, and schedule follow-up appointments within the next 2 weeks. Grandpa Walter listened more carefully than I did, nodding quietly while the doctor explained stress-related exhaustion and severe nutritional deficiency in calm professional terms. Every few seconds, Grandpa glanced toward me with worry hidden behind his steady expression. When the nurse finally handed over my paperwork, he reached for it before I could even sit up completely. I have. Got it, he said softly. Outside, the winter air felt sharp against my skin as we walked slowly through the parking garage. Gray clouds hung low over the city, and the wind carried the smell of snow somewhere in the distance. Grandpa kept one hand lightly against my elbow, as if he thought I might disappear if he let go for too long. His old Ford pickup sat near the far end of the lot, slightly crooked between the painted lines and dusted with rust around the wheel wells. The truck heater rattled loudly once we got inside, blowing out uneven warmth that smelled faintly like motor oil and peppermint gum. Grandpa drove carefully through downtown traffic while old country music played quietly through the speakers. Neither of us spoke much at first. I leaned my head against the cold window and watched graduation banners flutter outside storefronts while groups of smiling families crossed sidewalks carrying flowers and balloons. Every once in a while, I spotted students in graduation caps taking pictures with their parents beneath the courthouse clock tower. I wondered what that kind of love felt like when it was effortless instead of earned. Halfway through the drive, my phone rang again. My mother's name appeared across the screen. I stared at it for a second before answering quietly. Hello. Claire, finally, my mother said immediately, sounding irritated instead of concerned. Your father and I have been trying to coordinate dinner plans all afternoon. People have been asking questions about yesterday. I blinked slowly. I was in the hospital. Yes, obviously, she replied with a sigh. But your collapse caused quite a scene. Several of your father's colleagues were there. One woman actually thought you fainted because of drinking. Grandpa's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I did not drink anything, I answered softly. Well, that is not really the point, she continued. The point is people talk. We need to make sure this does not become some dramatic family narrative online. I felt something inside me go strangely numb then. Not angry, not surprised, just tired in a deeper way than before. Did you even want to know if I was okay? I asked. Quietly. Silence filled the truck for a few seconds. Then my mother gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. Of course you are okay. The hospital discharged you, did they not? I closed my eyes briefly. I have to go. Before she could answer, I ended the call, and lowered the phone slowly into my lap. The truck stayed silent except for the hum of the engine and the soft crackle of static from the radio speakers. Grandpa did not speak right away. He simply drove another few blocks before finally saying, "You know none of this is your fault, right?" I swallowed hard and looked down at my trembling hands. I keep thinking maybe if I worked harder or handled things better. No, his voice remained calm, but firm enough to stop me completely. "Listen to me carefully, sweetheart. Children are not supposed to spend their lives convincing their parents to care about them." My chest tightened painfully at that, because no one had ever said it out loud before. The truth had always existed quietly beneath everything, but hearing another person acknowledge it made it suddenly real. Snowflakes began falling lightly against the windshield as Grandpa turned onto the familiar road leading toward my apartment. Tiny white specks melted instantly against the glass while the truck heater hummed softly between us. And for the first time in years, sitting beside the only person who consistently showed up for me, I started wondering what my life might look like if I finally stopped chasing love from people who had already decided not to give it. Grandpa insisted on walking me all the way upstairs to my apartment, even though snow had already started collecting along the sidewalks outside. By the time we reached the third floor, his breathing sounded heavier than usual, but he still refused to let me carry the grocery bag hanging from his wrist. "You need to save your strength," he said quietly whenever I reached for it. My apartment looked exactly the way I had left it 2 days earlier, except somehow sadder now that someone else could see it too. The tiny kitchen sink held 2 unwashed coffee mugs beside a stack of instant noodle cups. My textbooks covered most of the dining table along with overdue utility notices I had shoved beneath a notebook, hoping not to think about them. Near the couch sat the same pair of worn sneakers I used for both classes and my evening shifts at the grocery store. Grandpa stepped inside slowly, his eyes moving carefully around the room without judgment. That somehow made everything feel more embarrassing. I suddenly saw the apartment through his eyes. The thin blankets folded over the couch because I could not always afford enough heat at night. The nearly empty refrigerator humming loudly in the corner. The secondhand furniture with scratches and uneven legs. I crossed my arms tightly over myself. "It looks worse than it usually does," I muttered softly. Grandpa glanced toward me with that calm expression of his. Looks lived into me. He carried the grocery bag into the kitchen and began quietly unpacking items onto the counter. Bread, soup cans, eggs, peanut butter, fresh fruit. My chest tightened again as I watched him line everything up carefully beside the sink. "Grandpa, do not start," he interrupted gently without turning around. "An old man cannot spoil his granddaughter a little." I looked down because I already felt tears pressing behind my eyes. He had probably spent half his week's paycheck buying groceries for me, even though he lived mostly on retirement checks and occasional repair jobs from neighbors. Meanwhile, my parents earned more money in a month than I made all year, yet somehow never noticed how thin I had become. Grandpa opened the refrigerator quietly, then paused for several seconds. When he turned back toward me, his face remained gentle, but there was pain in his eyes now too. "Claire," he asked softly, "how long has it been this hard?" I tried answering casually. "It is fine. I just had some extra expenses this semester." But the lies sounded weak even to me. Grandpa leaned both hands against the kitchen counter and studied me silently for a moment. "The doctor said your iron levels were dangerously low," he said carefully. "You do not end up in a hospital from one bad day. This has been going on a while." I sank slowly onto the couch, suddenly too exhausted to keep pretending anymore. The apartment felt unbearably quiet except for the ticking sound from the old radiator near the window. I was trying to finish school without asking anyone for help, I admitted finally. Tuition went up again after winter break. Then my rent increased in March. I picked up extra shifts at the store, but some weeks I could barely keep up. Grandpa sat down across from me without speaking. I stared at my hands while the words kept coming out before I could stop them. Sometimes I skipped meals because it felt easier than falling behind on bills. And I did not want Mom saying I was irresponsible again. The silence afterward felt enormous. Grandpa lowered his gaze briefly before rubbing one hand over his weathered face. "Sweetheart," he said quietly, "your parents truly did not know any of this?" I gave a hollow laugh that did not sound much like laughter at all. "They never asked." Snow drifted softly outside the apartment window while the room settled into stillness around us. Grandpa looked toward the stack of unpaid notices on the table. then toward the grocery store uniform hanging over the kitchen chair, finally back toward me. And for the first time since all this started, I saw something shift behind his normally gentle expression. Not disappointment, not pity, something quieter, sadder, like a man slowly realizing just how much pain someone he loved had been carrying completely alone. Grandpa stayed at my apartment until nearly midnight that evening. He fixed the loose cabinet hinge above the stove without mentioning it, tightened the wobbling leg on my kitchen table, and replaced the dead battery in the smoke detector after finding one in the glove compartment of his truck. He moved through the apartment quietly, repairing little things the same way he always had throughout my childhood. Back then, whenever something broke, Grandpa never made a speech about responsibility or blame. He simply rolled up his sleeves and fixed what he could. Around 10:30, I noticed him sitting unusually still at the table, staring down at the stack of overdue notices beside my textbooks. His reading glasses rested low on his nose while snow continued drifting softly outside the windows. "How much do you owe?" he asked carefully without looking up. My stomach tightened immediately. "It is not that bad." He lifted one eyebrow slightly. I sighed and sank onto the chair across from him. "About $4,000 between rent, utilities, and some medical bills from last winter." Grandpa slowly removed his glasses. "Claire, I was handling it," I said quickly, though the words sounded weaker than I intended. "I just needed graduation to happen first. Then I could work full-time." Grandpa leaned back in the chair, rubbing one hand thoughtfully against his jaw. "How many jobs were you working?" "2 during the semester. 3 during breaks." His expression changed slightly at that. 3. I nodded faintly. "Morning classes, grocery store shifts at night, and I cleaned offices downtown on weekends." Silence settled heavily between us again. The radiator clicked softly behind me, while somewhere outside a snowplow rumbled down the street. Grandpa looked toward the thin shadows beneath my eyes before speaking again. "And your parents truly believed you were doing fine?" I gave another small hollow laugh. "Mom thought I lost weight because I was exercising more." He closed his eyes briefly then. Not dramatically, just one exhausted blink that somehow carried years of disappointment inside it. After a while, he stood slowly from the table and reached into the inside pocket of his flannel jacket. He pulled out a folded envelope and placed it gently beside my textbooks. "What is that?" I asked. "Open it." I hesitated before sliding the envelope toward myself. Inside was a cashier's check. My breath caught immediately when I saw the amount. It covered every overdue bill sitting on the table and more. "Grandpa, no." I pushed it back toward him instantly. "Absolutely not." "Yes." His voice remained calm, but steady enough that I froze. "I cannot take your savings." "Sweetheart, I am 78 years old. What exactly am I saving it for?" Tears burned suddenly behind my eyes again. "You worked your whole life for this money." Grandpa smiled sadly. "And I spent my whole life hoping my family would take care of each other." I looked down at the check because I could not bear the tenderness in his expression anymore. "I should have noticed sooner," he admitted quietly after a long pause. "I knew something was wrong these past few years. You looked tired every time I saw you. Too thin, too quiet. But I kept telling myself your parents would step in eventually." My throat tightened painfully. "It is not your fault." "Maybe not," he said softly. "But I am done pretending this family dynamic is normal." The words lingered heavily in the apartment air. I slowly raised my eyes toward him again. Something about Grandpa felt different tonight. Still gentle, still warm. But beneath it now sat a kind of quiet resolve I had never seen before. He folded his hands together on the table and looked directly at me. "Your mother called me earlier," he said calmly. My chest tightened instantly. "What did she say?" Grandpa's jaw shifted slightly before he answered. "She wanted to know whether your collapse was going to become embarrassing for the family." The room fell completely still. Even the radiator seemed quieter somehow. I stared at him while something cold and painful settled deeper into my chest. Not shock anymore. Not confusion. Just clarity. Because hearing the truth from another person made it impossible to keep making excuses for them. The next 3 days passed quietly. Too quietly. Snow continued falling over the city in soft, steady waves while I recovered inside my apartment surrounded by textbooks, canned soup, and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being cared for. Grandpa called every morning around 7:30 sharp to make sure I had eaten breakfast. Every afternoon he stopped by after leaving his workshop, usually carrying something small in a paper bag. fresh bread from the bakery near his house, homemade chili packed into old plastic containers, a space heater he claimed he was not using anyway, even though I knew perfectly well his own house stayed cold during winters because he hated expensive utility bills. Each time he visited, he fixed something else around the apartment without making a production out of it. A loose window latch, the flickering bathroom light, the leaking kitchen faucet that had been dripping for nearly 2 months. He never asked for praise afterward. He simply wiped his hands on an old rag and moved on to the next thing. Meanwhile, my parents remained strangely absent except for occasional texts from my mother asking whether I planned on attending the family dinner Sunday evening, because people would expect to see me after graduation weekend. Not once did she mention the hospital again. Not once did my father call. By Sunday afternoon, a hard knot of exhaustion had settled deep inside me again, though this time it felt emotional more than physical. I almost told my mother I was not coming to dinner at all, but Grandpa called around noon and quietly said, "I think you should come tonight." Something in his tone made me pause. Why? There was a brief silence on the line before he answered. Because some things need to be said out loud eventually. The drive to my parents' house that evening felt strangely familiar in the worst way. Their neighborhood looked exactly like it always had. Large brick homes lined with decorative wreaths and professionally trimmed hedges. Warm yellow light glowing through spotless windows. Everything polished. Everything perfect from the outside. My mother opened the front door before I could even knock properly. "Claire," she said quickly while air kissing my cheek. "Thank goodness you look healthier." People were starting to worry. I stared at her for a second. She wore an expensive cream-colored sweater with gold jewelry resting neatly against perfectly styled hair. Not a single trace of concern crossed her face. Only relief that I no longer looked embarrassing. Inside, the dining room table was already set with expensive china and folded linen napkins. My father sat at the head of the table scrolling through emails on his phone, while Grandpa Walter quietly drank coffee near the kitchen window. The second I stepped inside, I noticed the tension in the room immediately. Grandpa looked calmer than usual somehow. Still gentle, still quiet, but settled in a way that made the entire atmosphere feel heavy. Dinner moved stiffly at first. My mother talked endlessly about graduation photos and upcoming charity events while my father nodded absently between phone notifications. Every time conversation drifted near the hospital incident, my mother redirected it toward appearances. Several people asked whether Claire was overworking herself again, she said while cutting into her chicken. I told them young people tend to dramatize stress these days. Grandpa slowly lowered his fork onto the plate. The soft clink against porcelain sounded louder than anything else in the room. "Dramatize?" he repeated quietly. My mother blinked toward him. "Well, you know what I mean." Grandpa leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with tired eyes that suddenly looked far older than 78. "No," he said calmly. "Actually, Linda, I do not." The room went completely still. My father finally looked up from his phone. My mother gave a strained laugh. "Dad, this is hardly the time for another lecture." Grandpa ignored her completely and turned toward my father instead. "Did you know your daughter was working 3 jobs while finishing school?" My father frowned slightly. 3 jobs. Did you know she was skipping meals because she could not afford groceries? Silence. My mother's expression hardened instantly. Claire should have communicated better if she was struggling financially. Grandpa looked at her for several long seconds before speaking again in that same calm, steady voice. Children should not have to collapse in public before their parents notice they are suffering. Nobody moved after that. Not my father. Not my mother. The only sound left was the grandfather clock ticking softly in the hallway, while the truth finally sat exposed in the middle of the table where nobody could pretend not to see it anymore. My mother recovered first. She always did. I watched her straighten slightly in her chair before forcing a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Dad, honestly, this feels unfair," she said carefully. "Claire is an adult. We assumed she would tell us if something was wrong." Grandpa Walter remained perfectly still at the end of the table. "You assumed," he repeated quietly. My father cleared his throat awkwardly beside her. "Nobody is saying we do. Not care about Claire." Grandpa finally looked directly at him then. "No," he said softly. "That is exactly what I am saying." The words landed heavily across the dining room. I stared down at my untouched plate because I suddenly felt too exposed sitting there between all of them. My mother folded her napkin carefully onto the table. I think everyone is being emotional because of what happened at graduation, she said. Claire has always been independent. We were trying to respect that. Grandpa gave a slow nod as if considering her words seriously. Independent, he murmured. That is an interesting way to describe a girl working herself sick while her parents host charity galas and post smiling family photographs online. My father's jaw tightened immediately. Now wait a minute. But Grandpa did not raise his voice. That somehow made the moment feel even heavier. Do you know what she kept apologizing for in the hospital? He asked quietly. Neither of them answered. She apologized for being inconvenient. Silence swallowed the room whole after that. My mother looked away first, toward the crystal serving dishes, toward the candles flickering softly near the center of the table. Anywhere except me. Grandpa leaned back slightly in his chair, his weathered hands folded calmly together. Children do not learn that kind of guilt on their own, he said. They learn it from spending years feeling like a burden every time they need love. Something inside my chest tightened painfully because hearing another person describe my entire life so clearly felt almost unbearable. My father exhaled sharply through his nose before standing from the table. This has become ridiculous, he muttered. Claire had opportunities most kids would dream about. Grandpa nodded faintly. Money is not the same thing as presence. The room went still again. I noticed my mother blinking faster now, irritation slowly replacing composure. So what exactly are you trying to say? She asked. Grandpa turned toward her fully for the first time all evening. I am saying your daughter collapsed in front of hundreds of people because she was exhausted, underfed, and emotionally drowning. His voice remained calm, steady. And your first concern was whether the family looked embarrassing. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again without speaking. For a moment, nobody moved at all. The grandfather clock ticked softly from the hallway while snow pressed gently against the dining room windows outside. Then Grandpa reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folded document onto the table beside his coffee cup. My father frowned immediately. What is that? Grandpa looked tired suddenly. Older somehow. I updated my estate paperwork last month, he answered quietly. My mother stared at him in confusion. Why are you bringing that up now? He met her eyes steadily. Because I spent years believing family meant protecting each other. But lately I have been watching this family fail the one person who needed kindness the most. My heartbeat quickened as my father slowly unfolded the document. His expression changed almost immediately. Dad. Grandpa looked toward me, then instead of them. I built that workshop with my own hands 40 years ago, he said softly. And I have decided it should belong to the person who still understands the value of showing up for people. The room fell completely silent after that. My mother's face drained of color, while my father stared down at the paperwork in stunned disbelief. But Grandpa simply reached for his coffee again with calm, weathered hands, as if the decision had already settled inside him long before tonight ever began. The drive home from my parents' house felt quieter than any silence I had ever experienced before. Snow drifted steadily beneath the headlights while Grandpa Walter kept both hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. He did not apologize for what happened at dinner. He did not try to soften the truth or explain away the tension hanging between our family members now. For once, nobody pretended things were normal anymore. And strangely, that honesty felt lighter than all the years we had spent protecting appearances. When we reached my apartment building, Grandpa turned off the engine but stayed sitting there for a moment. The old truck creaked softly around us while snowflakes melted against the windshield. You doing all right? He asked quietly. I looked down at my hands folded in my lap. I do not know, I admitted honestly. Everything feels different now. Grandpa nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. Sometimes different is the first honest thing that happens to a person in years. I glanced toward him then. The dashboard lights softened the deep lines across his weathered face, and suddenly I noticed again how much older he looked lately. Not fragile exactly, just tired in a way I had ignored before because I always assumed he would somehow remain strong forever. You should not have done all that tonight, I whispered. Now Mom and Dad are going to resent you too. Grandpa smiled faintly. Sweetheart, at my age you stop worrying so much about who gets uncomfortable when the truth finally enters the room. I laughed softly under my breath despite the heaviness inside my chest. Then his expression gentled again. I need you to hear something clearly, he said. None of this changed your worth. Their inability to love properly is not proof that you were difficult to love. The words settled deep inside me in a place that still felt bruised from years of quiet disappointment. I had spent most of my life believing love needed to be earned through performance, through grades, through achievements, through making myself smaller and easier and less needy. But sitting there beside the one person who had consistently shown up without conditions, I started realizing something painful and freeing at the same time. Real love had never asked me to prove I deserved it. A few weeks later, life began shifting slowly in ways I never expected. I accepted a full-time position with a publishing company downtown using the degree I had nearly destroyed myself trying to earn. The paycheck was modest, but steady. Grandpa still stopped by every Sunday carrying groceries I pretended not to need. Sometimes we ate dinner together inside his workshop surrounded by old tools, coffee cans full of loose bolts, and country music humming softly through a dusty radio near the workbench. My parents called more often after that dinner, though the conversations always sounded careful now, as if they suddenly realized I could see through the performance they had spent years maintaining. My mother apologized once in a stiff, uncomfortable voice that sounded more practiced than heartfelt. My father tried offering financial help after Grandpa updated his estate paperwork, but something inside me had already shifted permanently. I no longer felt desperate for their approval. The strangest part was that Grandpa never acted triumphant afterward. He never criticized them publicly or demanded gratitude from me. He simply continued showing up the same way he always had. Quietly, consistently, without making love feel transactional. One snowy evening near the end of winter, I found him asleep in the worn recliner inside his workshop with an unfinished mug of coffee resting beside him and an old blanket across his knees. The soft yellow lamp above his workbench cast warm light across shelves lined with decades of tools and photographs. I stood there for a long moment, just watching him breathe quietly in that familiar little room that smelled like cedar wood and engine oil. Then I gently pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders the same way he had done for me in the hospital. And as snow fell softly outside the garage windows, I finally understood something that changed me forever. The doctors had called my parents because they were supposed to be the people who loved me most. But the only person who truly came for me was the man who had been teaching me the meaning of love my entire life without ever needing to say it out loud.